Hey, class, in this series of podcasts and also a documentary I'll be posting, you're going to be learning about the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in late August 1942, the actual battle for the city itself, and stretched until the German defeat in early 1943. Stalingrad, probably the largest battle in human history in terms of the size of the armies, in terms of the casualties. Um, it is the turning point of the war because after Stalingrad, the German army never really was able to mount a serious offensive again. And in the collective memory of the United States, or the public memory of the United States, D-Day, the invasion of France in 1944, June of 1944, that's always front and center for Americans. And somehow we've forgotten just how crazy and insane the war in the Soviet Union between the German army and the Soviet army and the Soviet people. Uh, it had been raging for years when D-Day happened. The statistic I've said a lot, and I'll probably say it more: 8 out of 10 German soldiers were killed by Soviet soldiers. So anyone that is a student, even a quasi-serious student of World War II, knows the significance of Stalingrad. Not to say D-Day isn't important. It does open the second front that Stalin was demanding, actually, from Pearl Harbor on. The Russians were desperate for a second front. The Americans or the British allies and other allies to attack Germany from the west, from France. So D-Day is not insignificant, of course, but Stalingrad it is the turning point of the war. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. So just to kind of recap the German position, it's the summer of 1942. The German attempt or expectation that the German army would come in and the Soviet Union would collapse the previous year obviously had gone up in smoke. At this point, there's a siege of Leningrad. There's an army laying siege to the city of Leningrad, which today is St. Petersburg. Horrific there, starvation, but a pretty static front in the northwest of the Soviet Union. The big question is, from the German point of view and the Soviet point of view, is where would Hitler focus his attention? Would the German army, in the Army Group Center, would it renew its attack on Moscow after being thrown back in December of 1941? Would it renew its attack on Moscow, the Soviet capital, or would it move in the south, in the Ukraine, in the Caucasus area? And I don't think you need to be reminded, pardon me, that Hitler always had his eye on Ukraine, the Caucasus, the wheat in Ukraine, the oil in the Caucasus and that area, the Black Sea area, the Caspian Sea area of the Soviet Union, which still is a major oil producer to this very day. So the question really becomes an attack on Moscow in 42, a renewed attack on Moscow, or an attack in the south. Now, Stalin was convinced that Hitler was going to attack Moscow again. He thought that Hitler was just determined to take the Soviet capital, and that's where Stalin's focus is. Well, Stalin is wrong, because Hitler comes up with this plan of attack in the southern part of the Soviet Union, in the Ukraine, in the Caucasus area. And I have a map on my screen, and I've also posted that map on Blackboard, which talks about this German campaign, and it was called Operation Blue. Operation Blue. That was the attack that ultimately leads, or that was the strategy that ultimately leads to the attack on Stalingrad, which is located on the Volga River. It's kind of a benign name, isn't it? Operation Blue, for such a bloody battle. But that's where Hitler landed on. Now, there was disagreement among the German high command about where to attack. The Germans had taken 850,000 casualties the previous year. Not insignificant. The Soviets had taken many more, but the German army had been bloodied in 1941. But it used the winter and spring to resupply. And the German high command wasn't really excited about Plan Blue, although it's not clear that they were able to offer any kind of better alternative. But the German position was very different in 42 than it was a year before. The U.S. had come into the war, very significant. And so basically, the Germans, I've talked about this, how you have to, in terms of strategy, you have to choose and maintain a strategic objective. And one of the problems strategically for the German army throughout the invasion of the Soviet Union was, what was their focus? Was it Leningrad? Was it Moscow? Was it Ukraine? Was it the Caucasus? And they kind of dispersed their forces throughout Russia. But in 42, Hitler decides to focus on Ukraine and the Caucasus. And this made sense because of his historic interest in that area and his belief that he could create a colony that he could feed Germany from Ukraine and give Germany oil through the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus. Also, Hitler was thinking that he needed a win in 1942. He is an absolute dictator, of course, and he's always pretty popular in Germany, even up until the time he commits suicide. But he needs a win, and he thinks the easiest place for him to get a win is in the southern part of the Soviet Union. He's also decided that he is not going to let any more German retreat. The German army had retreated from Moscow about 100 miles in the previous December. But Hitler has decided that no more retreats. It's too embarrassing for his government. And that the army, even though it's bloodied, has to stay on the offensive. And so he decides the best place for the offensive is in the southern part of the Soviet Union, in the Ukraine area, all the way to Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad is not in the Ukraine. It's in the traditional Russian part of the Soviet Union. But what Hitler wants to do is consolidate his gains in Ukraine, move out of the Ukraine and into the heart of Russia, not Ukraine, Russia, not Belarus, Russia, but Russia, the real motherland of Russia. And Stalingrad is in the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Now, Hitler argued that this plan would be a knockout punch. That's the way he put it. He always talked in that kind of language. But the German general staff thought it was a poor man's offensive. They were never really enthusiastic about it. But nonetheless, they have to follow Hitler's orders. So one historian has written, for Hitler, the priority was not Moscow, which might have led to a Soviet defeat. Actually, I don't think the occupation of Moscow would have led to a defeat of the Soviet Union. I think Stalin would have done what the Russians did when Napoleon captured Moscow. They just would have retreated further east. There was still a lot of territory east of Moscow. But what he focuses on are the resources in southern Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus region. Hitler insisted against the instinct of his generals because he saw economics as critical in warfare. by attacking and by consolidating his gains in the rest of the Ukraine, moving into the Russian territory itself, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, and then also by capturing the oil producing parts of the Soviet Union, Hitler could win the war more easily. So that's where we're at in the summer of 42. Stalin is thinking that the attack's going to come in Moscow. And so he's surprised, but Hitler has decided to attack further south.